start getting into the next actual topic, which is going to be Matt Walsh and how he feels about early voting. So let's get into that. This is not going to be the longest of topics, but there's certainly a conversation to be had here. So let's go ahead and take a look here. So on Twitter, Matt Walsh posted, "I love it when I see people having difficulties with early voting. There shouldn't be any such thing as early voting. So the more problems, the better. Election should happen on election day and at no other time." Let's go ahead and get into why this is a logistical nightmare after we finish reading his tweet after this. "The whole idea of people voting before the campaigns have even concluded, while the candidates are still making their cases, while debates are still on the schedule, is madness. Completely crazy. No defending it." Okay. So, let's say you're somebody like me, and we have a two-party system, right? And the only reason that I voted the day of is because I don't trust Brian Kemp. I don't trust the person in charge of my state because he has such a long history of fucking over the ballots. So I decided to vote the day of to guarantee that my vote would be calculated, cast, everything. That's why I did what I did. That's why I voted when I did, as I did. But do the votes done before the cases are made count? Yes. Okay, so what's crazy? Matt Walsh's argument seems to be that because debates are still happening, because people are still making their cases, then that means that we should have early voting. Well, there's a time before election day and after the final debate. There's a time frame where all the cases have already been made. And people are still campaigning to convince people, but the cases have already been made. Every debate has already been had. Every single thing is something that you could have found on your candidate's platform up until that point. So what's crazy about early voting? Nothing, really. If you're a well-informed voter and you know what your person who you're voting for is going to stand for, then you already knew that before even the first debate. If you are waiting on the debate, which is going to be 60% theater and not just data, and that's what you're using to determine who you're voting for, I'm sorry. If a debate is what changes your mind on something, as opposed to looking into a policy, looking into what a candidate is standing for, looking into the things that they are trying to do, if the debate stage is where you made your decision, why? Why would you make your decision based on that? That doesn't make any sense to me. Again, because the debate is 60% theater. I've made an argument before about the reason why platforming is so important, why you have to be responsible with how you platform people. And it's because so much of convincing someone to something comes down to the theater, comes down to the rhetoric, not necessarily the actual substance of what's being said. As a result, I'm left to ask, why is Matt so upset about early voting? And I can tell you one reason why. People who have all the time in the world to vote are usually people who are very well-to-do. They can take a day off because they have a salaried position. They can take a day off because they've got PTO. They can take a day off to go vote because it's just a thing they can do. Now, you know who doesn't have that same ability? Somebody who's got 3 jobs. Somebody who desperately needs the system to work for them. That person, it's not easy for them to go on voting day. Because even though your job is supposed to let you out and let you go take care of voting on that day, if you work 2 or 3 jobs, because that's what you need to make enough to support your family, and therefore 16, 18 hours of your day are all spoken for on election day when everybody's going to be out, especially if you're working in fast food, that day is already hectic. You might not have the energy to even safely drive to a polling location. You barely have enough energy to safely get home. So why would we want things to be more difficult on this person? Well, given how Matt operates, I would assume that he actually wants it to be harder for working class people to vote. I don't have a way of verifying this 100%, aside from the fact that his Twitter calls him a theocratic fascist, but I think that's mainly a joke. I have no way of verifying that he specifically wants the working class to have a harder time voting. The logical consequence, we talked about that in another video, the logical consequence of only having a single day for voting and everybody having to cram themselves, especially during a pandemic that's evolved into an endemic, it's not even the most healthy thing, but everybody having to cram themselves into one building per location, depending on where your polling location is, for your county, for your state. The mere logistics of it means that people will be waiting for a long-ass time. Makes it harder for people to vote. And it specifically makes it harder for working class people to vote. If Matt Walsh wants working class people to have a harder time voting, which is really the only people it's going to affect, it makes sense. It makes sense that he writes for the Daily Mail. It makes sense, or the Daily Wire, rather. It makes sense that he argues for conservative positions, because those people shouldn't be able to vote anyway, because they're at the lower end of the hierarchy, right, Matt? Now, I'm sure if Matt sees this video, he's going to argue that that's not what I meant, that's not what I mean, but that's the logical consequence of what you're doing. So if you know the logical consequence is that it's going to be harder for working class people to vote, then why would you push for something that makes it harder for them to vote in general? But let's see what some of the takes on this are, because it's not just this. Also, opinion on mandatory voting. I think voting should be mandatory. I think participation in the democratic process, if you live in a nation, should be mandatory. Now, I'm wishy-washy on if there should be punitive measures, but I do think that it should be mandatory. I also think whatever day we have for voting should be a holiday. It should be just a thing that you said, you have to go do this thing. I think voting should be as easy as possible. I think that if we can figure out a way to verify IDs, we should make it to where you're able to vote using your ID with a fucking phone. It should be mandatory and easy. There's nothing wrong with it being mandatory if it is easy to vote. But let's see what some of the takes are on this. So, there was this little interaction here. I pointed out that, holy shit, what I knew conservatives were for voter suppression, but holy shit. Because really, like I said earlier, this is voter suppression. This is suppressing the ability for working class people to effectively vote. That's what this does. We get a response from this user here, Tiger Sonic. I agree that voting should be harder because we can't let anybody vote. I agree with this guy. But why? Why would somebody want... I mentioned the hierarchy thing. Why would somebody think there are certain, essentially, undesirables who should not be allowed to vote? And he says, well, because we get people voting for politicians that just tread on people's freedoms, and people vote for politicians that just offer free stuff. So this one sounds like a jab at someone like Bernie Sanders. Though nothing Bernie Sanders has offered is really free. It's stuff that you would get via, your taxes. Said the masses are easily swayed by crooked politicians. This is not untrue. The entire MAGA movement is an example of this. So I ask, how do you litmus test who should be allowed to vote? If you're worried about the masses being swayed, which I would say the counter to that is having a more robust education system, their answer is that nobody should vote. That's interesting, right? That's an interesting perspective. Why would you argue that nobody should be allowed to vote? Right? Why would you argue that? So I think nobody should vote. One user, Airlith Vineyard, responds, so how do we determine who gets into office then? Do we do straws? Do we just lump it into choice centers? If you're not going to be governing for the people and by the people, which is your primary goal, in like Western democracy, you shouldn't belong in politics. But let's see what the response is to this. And note, this is a response to Matt Walsh's argument that voting should be harder for people for some fucking reason. It'll be one person in charge, like a king or a queen, and it will be governed for the good of the people. And the elective officials don't work for us. They just want your vote and your money. They don't care about the regular citizens. Well, what would the argument be that a king or a queen would care about the citizens either. I wonder what's happened to most other monarchies in the past. No, this is not a troll. Because if you find this thread on Twitter, I'm not saying go look for it. I'm not saying go bully this person. Please don't do that. That's fucking stupid. Don't do that. Arguments have already happened. There's roughly 10 hours of conversation with this person afterwards where they tried their best to justify their position for monarchy. Why would you want monarchy except to just have somebody whose boots you can lick? Have somebody who aesthetically you can just go, I have my freedoms, but you look great. Just imagine this is a boot here, and it's not a police officer's boot, so the joke isn't going to work as well, but you're just like, you're sitting there doing that. Without an idea of some sort, how can you ensure people don't vote multiple times? I already mentioned when I said before, I would like voting to happen with an ID. Like, you vote with an ID right now. You take your driver's license and you use it, and then that gets used as your vote. So, yeah, no, it's you can't just go, I want a king or a queen. Okay, well, how are we going to determine who's king or queen? How are we going to determine that? Why would we want it to be difficult for people to vote? I just don't get it. Unless, of course, you think that there should be an established hierarchy and that hierarchy is justified and that it needs to be there for whatever reason. I mean, that's kind of where you get with the king or the queen thing. Though the argument that the king or the queen is not going to just trounce on your liberties is strange to me. I know in that thread later they argue that they're a minarchist, which, cool, then why the fuck do you have the king or the queen anyway? Like, what's the point of that? We'll use a fighting tournament to determine who actually gets to be king or queen. Everybody gets together in a round of Smash Brothers, which, knowing what's happened with the Smash Brothers community, let's not do that. We already have Trump in office. We don't need other alleged predators potentially getting power. So when I see shit like Matt Walsh posting here, I love it when people are having difficulties with early voting. Why? Why do you have such a contempt for a system that tries to allow people to have functionally some say in what goes on in their country so that you want it to be hard for people? I've seen some takes where people have argued that it shouldn't be easy to participate in democracy. It shouldn't be easy. Why should it be easy? It should be easy so that everybody can do it. You want everybody to be represented, make it to where everybody can be represented. That's how that works. So hopefully you guys enjoyed that one. That one's just short. That's just a take on random Twitter nonsense. Because, of course, Matt Walsh has Twitter nonsense. We've got other stuff from Matt Walsh that we'll be going over, though. Apparently he thinks that there's no difference between leftism and insanity, which is weird coming from a traditional conservative. But that's not in and of itself an argument. Hopefully you guys enjoyed that, and we will be continuing on.